The 50th woman left Julian Thorne's penthouse without knowing she had already lost. He watched her heels click across the marble floor, the door closing behind her with a soft, expensive hush. 50 women in one night. 50 different perfumes, 50 different smiles, 50 different versions of the same sentence. You're the most brilliant man I've ever met. None of them meant it. Julian could always tell. He loosened his collar and looked out at the Chicago skyline, glittering black and gold 30 floors below. Somewhere out there was his tower, the one going up on Riverfront Plaza, the one every business magazine in the city had already called his legacy project. He was 29 years old, and he ran half the logistics that moved through this city, legal and otherwise. He controlled warehouses, shipping lanes, construction permits that other men waited years to get. And still, tonight, he felt like the loneliest man in Illinois. His assistant, Marcus, stepped forward with a tablet. "That's the last one, sir. Should I have the car service take you home, or—" "There's one more." Marcus blinked. "Sir, the list said 50. "There's a woman waiting in the hallway. I saw her when I let the last one out." Julian had noticed her the way he noticed everything, quickly and without appearing to. She'd been leaning against the wall near the elevator, arms crossed, wearing a plain grey blazer instead of the silk and sequins the others had worn. She hadn't been on his list. She looked like she didn't want to be there at all. "Send her in." The woman who walked through the door didn't smile. She didn't extend her hand. She looked around the penthouse like she was inspecting it for problems, which, as it turned out, she was. "You're not one of the 50, Julian said. "No." Her voice was flat, unimpressed. "I'm Evelyn Mercer. I'm a structural engineer. I was supposed to meet a contractor here about a completely unrelated matter, and your assistant downstairs told me I could wait in line, like this was a job fair." She crossed her arms tighter. "I don't want anything from you, Mr. Thorne. I just want my ride to show up." Julian almost laughed. In one night, 50 women had told him he was the reason the sun rose in the morning, and the 51st was telling him she wanted to leave. "Sit down anyway," he said. 5 minutes. "I don't do small talk." "Good, neither do I." He gestured toward the window, toward the skeletal outline of his tower rising against the dark. "Tell me what you see." She hesitated, then walked to the glass, studying the structure with narrowed eyes. Something shifted in her posture. The boredom fell away, replaced by focus. "You want the polite answer or the real one?" "I've had 50 polite answers tonight. Give me the real one." "Your load distribution on floors 12 through 18 is wrong," she said, not looking at him. "Whoever drew those blueprints shaved the support columns to save on material costs, and they compensated with a cantilever design that won't hold under wind shear once you're above story 15. In 5 years, maybe less if this city gets a bad winter, you're going to see stress fractures. If nobody catches it before the concrete's poured, you're not looking at a repair bill, you're looking at a headline." The room went quiet. Julian had heard 50 women call him brilliant that night. This woman had just told him, in under 30 seconds, that his crown jewel of a project was structurally flawed enough to collapse. He felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Genuine interest. "You're certain?" "I don't say things I'm not certain about." She finally turned to face him. "Why does that matter to you? You didn't hire me. You don't even know my name until 30 seconds ago." "Because everyone in that hallway tonight told me what they thought I wanted to hear. You told me something you thought I needed to hear, even though it wasn't good for you." He studied her, sharp eyes, tired shoulders, a woman clearly carrying more weight than her plain blazer let on. "That's rare, Miss Mercer. Rarer than you think." "I'm not here to impress you." "I know. That's exactly why you did." Marcus, still standing by the door, looked between them like he was watching a chess match he didn't understand the rules to. Julian walked closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head up slightly to hold his gaze. "I've spent tonight interviewing 50 women for a marriage arrangement. Business reasons. None of them mattered. You just told me my flagship project is structurally compromised without blinking, without flattering me, without asking for a single thing in return." Evelyn's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. I don't want to be part of whatever this was tonight. I'm not asking you to want it. Julian's voice dropped, low and certain, the voice he used when a decision was already made and everyone in the room simply needed to catch up. I'm telling you. Congratulations, Miss Mercer. Out of 51 women, you're the one I choose. She stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Neither of them knew yet how much was already moving behind the scenes, a debt her father owed to men far more dangerous than Julian, a payment already quietly wired that very afternoon, a decision Julian had made before she'd ever opened her mouth about cantilevers and stress fractures. Evelyn Mercer had walked into that penthouse wanting nothing more than a ride home. She was about to find out she couldn't leave even if she wanted to, and not for the reason she'd expect. Evelyn hadn't slept. She'd spent most of the night convinced Julian Thorne was joking, and the rest of it convinced he wasn't, which was somehow worse. By the time the sun came up over her cramped apartment on the west side, she'd already packed a bag. Not for a wedding, for a flight. She had a ticket booked to Lisbon for 6 days from now, money scraped together from selling her car, and a plan that involved disappearing before her father's creditors caught up with either of them. She told herself the meeting at Thorne Enterprises that morning was just a formality. Sign whatever rejection paperwork rich men use to clean up messes like this, get it over with, go back to her life. The headquarters took up an entire block downtown, glass and steel, with the Thorne name etched into the lobby wall in brushed silver letters. A receptionist led her up to the 32nd floor without a word, like she was expected, like her name was already in a system somewhere. Julian was waiting in a corner office with a view that made her stomach drop, not from height, but from what it represented. Money, power, the kind of reach that could crush a person without even meaning to. Miss Mercer. He stood as she entered, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. On the desk sat a folder, thick and official-looking. I assume you're here for the paperwork. I'm here so I can catch my flight without looking over my shoulder. She didn't sit. Whatever last night was, I'm not interested. I have a life. I have problems that have nothing to do with you. Sit down, Miss Mercer. Something in his tone made her sit, even though every instinct told her not to. He slid the folder across the desk. She opened it, expecting a rejection agreement, maybe a non-disclosure form, something with her name on a line she could sign and walk away from. Instead, she found an employment contract. Lead Structural Engineer, Thorne Commercial Division. A salary printed at the top that made her blink twice to make sure she was reading it correctly. This isn't what I asked for. I know. I told you last night I wasn't interested in whatever arrangement you were running. And I'm not offering you an arrangement. Julian leaned back in his chair, studying her the way he had the night before, like she was a puzzle he found more interesting the longer he looked at it. I'm offering you a job. You caught a structural flaw in my flagship project in under 30 seconds. I have engineers on payroll who've worked that site for 8 months and missed it. I don't let talent like that walk out the door because of pride. So this has nothing to do with last night, the marriage thing. It has everything to do with last night. His eyes didn't move off her face. But not the way you think. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She hated riddles. She hated men who spoke in half-truths even more. Then tell me what you mean, because I have a flight to catch in 6 days and I'd like to know if I'm still on it. Julian was quiet for a moment. It was the first time she'd seen him hesitate. Your father owes money to Corbin Reyes. The name hit her like a slap. She felt her whole body go still. How do you know that name? Because everyone in my world knows that name, Julian said. Reyes doesn't lend money. He traps people. Your father borrowed against a shipping contract that never came through, and now he owes triple what he took, with interest that grows every week he doesn't pay. Reyes doesn't take checks, Miss Mercer. He takes collateral, property, businesses, sometimes people. Evelyn's hands were shaking, and she hated that they were. How long have you known? Since before you walked into my building last night. The room tilted slightly. She thought of the past 3 weeks, the anonymous calls to her father's phone, the black car that had idled outside her apartment for 2 nights straight before vanishing, her father's refusal to explain any of it beyond, "Don't worry about it, Evie, I'm handling it." He hadn't been handling anything. He'd been drowning, and she'd been the only one who noticed the water rising. "That's why I was leaving," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "I thought if I disappeared, Reyes would lose interest in finding leverage over my father. I wasn't running from a marriage interview. I was running from a war I didn't start." "I know." Julian's voice was steady, almost gentle, which unsettled her more than his usual sharpness did. "Which is why, yesterday afternoon, before you ever set foot in my penthouse, my firm wired the full amount your father owes to Reyes's holding company, paid in full. No interest, no negotiation, no favor owed on your father's part." Evelyn stared at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because Reyes doesn't stop at fathers," Julian said. "He goes after daughters next, when the money runs dry. I wasn't going to let that happen to a woman who told me the truth about my own building when 50 others lied to my face." Something in Evelyn's chest cracked open. Confusion tangled with disbelief, tangled with something she refused to name yet. "So the job, the contract, this isn't a trap. It's an offer." Julian pushed the folder an inch closer to her. "You can sign it and stay, work a job you're clearly better at than half my current staff. Or you can walk out that door, catch your flight, and never think about Riverfront Plaza again. The debt is paid either way. I didn't buy your gratitude, Miss Mercer. I bought your safety." Evelyn looked down at the contract, at her name typed neatly at the top of a page that represented an entirely different life than the one she'd planned 6 days from now. She didn't sign it, not yet, but she didn't leave either. Evelyn didn't sign the contract that day. She took it home instead, folded it into her bag like something too heavy to decide on right away, and told Julian she needed time to think. 3 days later, she was standing in a hard hat at Midway Industrial Park, walking the site of Thorn Enterprises' largest active commercial development, because thinking, it turned out, wasn't something she could do while sitting still. She'd called Julian's office and asked for access to the blueprints instead of an answer. If she was going to consider working for this man, she wanted to see with her own eyes whether the flaw she'd caught at Riverfront Plaza was a one-time mistake or a pattern. It didn't take long to find out it was worse than a pattern. The site foreman, a heavy-set man named Danny, who'd clearly been told to give her whatever she asked for, led her through the skeleton of the half-built structure. Rebar cages stood exposed against the grey morning sky, and the smell of wet concrete hung heavy in the air. Evelyn moved through it like she'd been born there, running her hands along support beams, checking measurements against the blueprints rolled under her arm. "These numbers are off," she said, more to herself than to Danny. "Off how?" She crouched near a support column, comparing the diameter against the spec sheet. "Too narrow. Not by much. A careless observer would never catch it, but enough to matter once the weight of 18 more floors pressed down on it." "Who approved these final blueprints?" Danny shrugged. "Comes down from corporate. I'll just build what they send." Evelyn spent the next 2 hours pulling every revision of the plans she could get her hands on, cross-referencing dates, initials, stamped approvals. What she found made her stomach drop the way it had in Julian's office 3 days earlier. Except this time, the fear wasn't about her father. The original blueprints, the ones filed 8 months ago, were structurally sound. Somewhere along the way, someone had submitted a revised version with subtly reduced support specifications, and that revised version was the one currently being built. The changes were small enough to pass a rushed inspection, small enough that any engineer not specifically looking for sabotage would miss them entirely. But they weren't accidents. Nobody accidentally shaved 4 separate support columns by the exact same margin across 2 different sites. This wasn't a design flaw. This was deliberate. She sat in her car in the site parking lot for a long time before she called Julian. "I need to see you," she said when he picked up. "Today. It's about the tower." He met her that evening in the same corner office, and she spread both sets of blueprints across his desk, the original and the altered, pointing out the discrepancies one by one. Julian's face, usually unreadable, shifted into something colder as she talked. "You're telling me someone inside my own company changed these plans? I'm telling you someone with access to your architectural files changed them, and did it carefully enough to avoid detection. This isn't a junior mistake. Whoever did this understood exactly how much they could shave off before it became visible to a casual inspection, and exactly how long it would take before it became a problem." She tapped the altered blueprint. "If this building goes up the way it's currently planned, you're not looking at years before something fails. You're looking at months, maybe weeks, depending on weather load." Julian was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the papers like they'd personally betrayed him. Who has access to make revisions like this? That's what I don't know yet. But whoever it is, they're good. Good enough that if I hadn't caught the discrepancy at Riverfront Plaza first, I never would have thought to check this site at all. Evelyn crossed her arms. "This isn't a one-building problem, Julian. This looks like someone is systematically compromising your projects. And if it's happening here and at Riverfront, I'd bet money it's happening somewhere else you haven't looked yet." Why would anyone do this? His voice was low, controlled in the way she was starting to recognize meant he was furious underneath it. "I don't know your business rivals. You do," she met his eyes. "But someone wants your buildings to fail publicly, not quietly, publicly and expensively, in a way that would destroy your reputation the moment you tried to move your operations into legitimate commercial real estate. A structural collapse isn't just a lawsuit. It's a headline that follows a company forever." Julian sat back slowly, and for the first time since she'd met him, Evelyn saw something flicker across his face that looked almost like fear. Not for himself, she realized, but for the people who might be standing in those buildings when they came down. "I need you to find out who's doing this," he said. "I haven't signed your contract." "I know." He looked at her, steady and certain despite everything she'd just handed him. "I'm not asking the engineer I hired. I'm asking the one person who's caught this twice while an entire department missed it both times." Evelyn looked down at the blueprints again, at the quiet, careful sabotage buried inside them, and felt the shape of her 6-day plan to disappear to Lisbon slipping further away with every passing hour. "Fine," she said, "but I do this my way. No interference, no corporate red tape slowing me down." Agreed. She didn't know it yet, but somewhere across the city, the person responsible for those altered blueprints already knew her name, and had just decided she was a problem that needed handling. Evelyn hadn't told her father anything yet. She'd been carrying Julian's confession around for 4 days, like a stone in her pocket, turning it over and over, and by the time she agreed to investigate the sabotage, she knew she couldn't keep it from her father any longer. He deserved to know his debt was gone. He deserved to know why. She found him at the small diner near his apartment, the one he went to every morning out of habit more than hunger, nursing a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. Robert Mercer looked older than he had 6 months earlier, his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to take up less space in the world. "Evie." He smiled when he saw her, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thought you were leaving for Lisbon this week." "I was." She sat across from him. "I'm not anymore." "Because of the job offer? Your message said something about an engineering position." "Because of Corbin Reyes." Her father's face went pale so fast it frightened. He glanced around the diner, like the walls themselves might be listening, then leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Where did you hear that name?" "Dad, I know about the loan. I know about the shipping contract that fell through. I know you've been getting calls, and I know a car's been sitting outside your building." She reached across the table and took his hand, feeling how cold it was. "I know because I found out the debt's already paid. Someone paid it. In full." He stared at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. "That's not possible. I would know. Reyes would have called, told me it was settled." "His name is Julian Thorne." Her father's hand went rigid under hers. "The Thorne name, from the mixer, the one you went to by accident." "He knew about the debt before I ever walked into his building." She watched the disbelief on her father's face shift slowly into something more complicated. Relief tangled with shame, tangled with suspicion. He wired the payment the same day, before he'd even offered me a job, before he knew if I'd take it. Why would a man like that do something like that for a stranger? It was the question Evelyn had been asking herself for 4 days straight, and she still didn't have a clean answer. I don't know. He said Reyes goes after daughters when the fathers run dry. He said he wasn't going to let that happen. Her father was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his cold coffee. Your mother used to say people show you who they are in the moments they think nobody's counting. He looked up at her. A man doesn't quietly pay off a stranger's debt unless there's something real behind it. Men like Reyes, they collect. They don't give things away for nothing. Julian's not like Reyes. You sound certain of that. I'm not certain of anything right now. She thought of the altered blueprints spread across Julian's desk, the fear that had flickered across his face when she'd told him someone was sabotaging his buildings. But I've watched him for 4 days, and everything he's told me has turned out to be true. That's rarer than you'd think, in his world or anyone else's. Her father studied her for a long moment, something knowing creeping into his expression that made her uncomfortable. You're not just talking about the debt anymore, are you? Evelyn didn't answer that. She wasn't ready to answer that, not even to herself. Later that afternoon, she met with the family accountant, an older woman named Priya, who'd handled her father's finances for a decade, to confirm everything Julian had told her. Priya pulled up the records without hesitation, turning her monitor so Evelyn could see the transaction history laid bare in black and white. A wire transfer from a Thorn Enterprises holding account, dated the afternoon before the mixer, cleared and confirmed with Reyes's firm within hours. It's real, Priya said. Whoever this Thorn is, he didn't just pay it off quietly. He paid it off fast enough that Reyes's people didn't have time to escalate. Another day or two, and your father would have been getting a very different kind of visit. Evelyn sat with that for a moment, the timeline settling into place with uncomfortable clarity. Julian hadn't just paid a debt, he'd made a decision, in the space of a single evening, to intervene in a stranger's crisis before that stranger had even agreed to speak to him again. She thought about the tower rising over Riverfront Plaza, about the altered blueprints hidden inside 2 of his active projects, about a rival somewhere in the city, patient enough to sabotage buildings months in advance. Whoever was targeting Julian understood exactly how much damage could be done quietly, over time, before anyone noticed. She wondered, walking back to her car, whether the same kind of patience was being aimed at her now, too. Evelyn went back to Riverfront Plaza alone on the 8th night, long after the construction crews had gone home. She hadn't planned on going at night. She'd meant to do a routine daylight walkthrough, verify the foundation pillars against the corrected blueprints she'd spent the past 3 days redrawing. But her afternoon had run long with meetings, and by the time she finished cross-checking the last set of load calculations, the sun had already dropped behind the skyline. She told herself one quick look wouldn't hurt. She had a flashlight, a hard hat, and a badge that let her through the site gate whenever she needed it. The tower stood quiet in the dark, its exposed frame lit only by a few security lamps scattered across the lot. Evelyn moved through it carefully, flashlights sweeping across the base of the structure where the foundation pillars anchored deep into the ground. This was the part of the building nobody thought about once the glass and steel went up around it, but it was the part that mattered most. If the foundation was compromised, nothing above it was safe. She found the first problem near Pillar 6. A control panel for the site's heavy lifting crane sat open, its casing pried loose, wires rerouted in a way that made her stomach turn cold. She wasn't an electrician, but she'd spent enough time on construction sites to recognize tempering when she saw it. Someone had rewired the crane's load limiter, the safety mechanism that kept it from lifting more weight than the structure below could handle. If that crane ran tomorrow morning the way it was currently wired, it would drop a fully loaded steel beam directly onto the compromised foundation pillars. Evelyn's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone to photograph the wiring, to document exactly what she was looking at before anyone could claim it had always been that way. She was so focused on the panel that she didn't hear the footsteps behind her until they were close. Don't move. She spun around, flashlight raised like a weapon, and found herself face to face with a man in dark clothing she didn't recognize, a radio clipped to his shoulder, his hand already reaching toward his jacket in a way that made every instinct in her body scream danger. "Side's closed," he said. "You need to leave." "I have clearance. I work for Thorn Enterprises." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. He took a step closer instead, and Evelyn took a step back, her mind racing through exits, through distances, through how far she'd have to run to reach her car. A pair of headlights swept across the lot before either of them could move again. A black sedan pulled through the gate fast, tires crunching against loose gravel, and Julian was out of it before it had fully stopped, another two men flanking him from a second vehicle behind. The man in dark clothing bolted the second he saw them, disappearing into the shadows between two stacks of rebar before anyone could catch him. Julian's men gave chase, but Evelyn already knew, the way you know these things in your gut, that they weren't going to find him. Julian crossed the distance between them in seconds, his hands landing on her shoulders like he needed to confirm she was actually standing there, actually unhurt. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Her voice shook slightly despite herself. "How did you know I was here?" "I've had eyes on this site since the sabotage at the industrial park. Security feed flagged movement 20 minutes ago." His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. "You should have called me before coming here alone." "I wasn't planning on staying past sunset." She gestured toward the open control panel, still glowing faintly under the flashlight she'd dropped near the base of Pillar 6. "Someone rewired the crane's load limiter. If it ran tomorrow the way it's currently set, it would have dropped a loaded beam right onto the pillars I flagged as compromised." Julian looked past her at the panel, and she watched something shift behind his eyes, calculation replacing fear. "That's not sabotage meant to slow us down. That's sabotage meant to end someone. Or several someones. That crew starts at 6 in the morning." Evelyn's voice cracked slightly on the last word, the adrenaline finally catching up to her. "If I hadn't come here tonight..." "You did come here tonight." Julian's hands stayed on her shoulders, grounding her. "And because you did, nobody dies tomorrow morning." One of his men returned from the chase, shaking his head. The intruder had gotten away clean, slipping out through a gap in the perimeter fence that had clearly been prepared in advance. "Whoever's doing this knows this site better than security does," the man reported. "Knew exactly where the blind spots were." Julian's expression darkened further at that. Evelyn watched him process it, watched the pieces settle into place behind his eyes with the same quiet fury she'd seen the day she first showed him the altered blueprints. "This isn't outside interference anymore," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Someone on the inside is feeding them everything. Site layouts, security gaps, timing." His eyes met Evelyn's, sharp and certain. "And now they know you're the one catching it." Julian didn't let her go home that night. He said it wasn't a request, and for once, Evelyn didn't argue. She sat in the back of his sedan while his men swept the perimeter of Riverfront Plaza one final time, and somewhere between the shaking in her hands finally settling and the city lights blurring past the window, she agreed to leave for Milwaukee at dawn. Julian wanted every blueprint from every active project pulled and re-examined, somewhere the leak couldn't reach, and his logistics hub 2 hours north was the only place he trusted enough for that right now. The drive up gave her too much time to think. "You said someone on the inside is feeding information to whoever's doing this," she said, watching the highway stretch out ahead of them. "You have a theory." "I have several." Julian's hands stayed steady on the wheel, though the muscle in his jaw hadn't fully relaxed since the sight. "None of them feel good." "Tell me anyway." He was quiet for a long stretch of road before he answered. "There are maybe 6 people in my company with access to both the architectural files and the site security schedules. People I've worked with for years. People I trusted enough to hand real authority to." His eyes flicked to her briefly. "That's what makes this harder than a normal business rivalry. Whoever's doing this isn't outside my walls anymore. They're inside them. The Milwaukee facility turned out to be nothing like Evelyn expected. Not a warehouse full of shady dealings, but a sprawling logistics center with loading docks, shipping schedules on digital boards, and a security team that checked identification twice before letting either of them through the front doors. Julian led her to a private conference room on the second floor, where a table had already been cleared for the blueprints she'd brought. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, laying out every active Thorn project side by side. Riverfront Plaza, the Midway site, 3 others Evelyn hadn't even known existed until that morning. She cross-referenced structural specs against the original filed versions, flagging discrepancies with a red pen, while Julian pulled personnel records for anyone who'd touched the files in question. Here, Evelyn tapped a set of numbers on the 3rd project, a mixed-use development on the north side. Same pattern, support columns shaved by a consistent margin, changes filed 11 days after the original approval. She looked up at him. Whoever's doing this isn't improvising. This has been planned and executed across multiple sites for months. Julian rubbed a hand across his face, the exhaustion finally showing through the composure he usually wore like armor. I built this company to get out of the world my father left me in. Grey market shipping, deals that lived in the space between legal and not. I thought if I moved into legitimate real estate, built things people could actually be proud of, I could leave that life behind for good. He looked at the blueprints spread across the table, and someone's using my own transition against me, making it look like I can't be trusted to build anything safely, right when I need people to trust me most. Is that what this is about? Reputation? It's about more than reputation. If word gets out that Thorn buildings are structurally unsound, every contract I've signed for legitimate commercial development collapses overnight. Investors pull out. City permits get frozen pending investigation. I lose everything I've spent 3 years trying to build, and I go right back to being exactly what my rivals want me to be. His eyes met hers, steady despite the weight behind them. A syndicate boss playing dress-up in a suit. Evelyn hadn't expected the honesty in that, the rawness of it. She'd spent the last week seeing him as untouchable, a man who controlled rooms without trying. This was the first time she'd seen the fear underneath it. Then we don't let them win, she said simply. We find the leak, we fix the buildings, and you finish what you started. You're saying we now. She hadn't noticed she had. I haven't signed the contract. You don't need to sign anything to be part of this, Evelyn. You already are. Julian studied her for a long moment across the table, something unspoken passing between them that neither of them addressed directly. I need someone who catches what everyone else misses. I need someone who tells me the truth even when it costs her something. I found that in a hallway outside my penthouse 8 days ago, and I'm not interested in losing it now. Evelyn looked down at the blueprints, at the careful sabotage buried inside months of legitimate paperwork, and felt something settle in her chest that hadn't been there when she'd walked into his office with a plane ticket to Lisbon in her bag. Then let's find out who's doing this, she said, all the way to the top. Julian nodded once, already reaching for the personnel files again, already narrowing the list of 6 names down toward the one that mattered. Neither of them noticed, in that quiet second-floor conference room 2 hours from the city, that the name they were looking for had been sitting inside Julian's own headquarters the entire time, close enough to touch, patient enough to wait. 6 days after Milwaukee, Julian insisted Evelyn attend the Regional Architectural Expo in Indianapolis with him, even though every instinct in her told her to stay behind and keep digging through personnel files instead. It's a public event, he said, adjusting his cufflinks in the hotel lobby that morning. Half the construction industry in the Midwest will be there. If I show up without my lead engineer, people will start asking questions about why. People are already asking questions. Then let's give them the answer we want them to have. He looked at her, something steady and reassuring in his expression, despite everything they'd uncovered over the past week. You redesigned the riverfront foundation in 4 days, Evelyn. Let people see the woman who did that. The expo floor stretched across an enormous convention hall, packed with booths showcasing new materials, digital modeling software, and glossy renderings of buildings that hadn't been built yet. Evelyn moved through it at Julian's side, aware of the glances that followed them, aware that in certain circles she'd apparently become a name worth whispering about. She didn't expect to be approached alone. It happened near the back of the hall, while Julian was pulled into a conversation with a city permitting official. A man in an expensive charcoal suit fell into step beside her, matching her pace like he'd been waiting for the opportunity. "Miss Mercer, I don't believe we've met." His smile was polished, practiced. "Corbin Reyes." Evelyn stopped walking. She'd heard that name exactly twice before, once from Julian across a desk, once from her own father's shaking voice in a diner booth, and both times it had come attached to fear. "You're the reason my father spent 3 months afraid to answer his own phone." "Your father made choices. I simply collected on them." Reyes's smile didn't waver. "Fortunately for him, Mr. Thorne stepped in before things escalated. Very generous of him, don't you think? Buying off a stranger's debt like that." "I don't have anything to say to you." "You don't need to say much. Just listen." He steered slightly, angling them both away from the main flow of foot traffic, toward a quieter corner near an unmanned booth. "I understand you've been doing quite a lot of work for Julian lately, redesigning foundations, reviewing blueprints across multiple sites. You've become rather essential to him in a very short time." Evelyn's pulse quickened, though she kept her face flat. "What do you want?" "Information." He said it simply, like he was asking for directions. "The revised structural plans for Riverfront Plaza, the ones you drew up after your little discovery. I'd pay very well for a copy, enough that you could disappear somewhere far more comfortable than Lisbon, if that's still on your mind." The mention of Lisbon made her blood run cold. He knew details he shouldn't know, details she hadn't shared with anyone outside Julian's inner circle. "You're the one sabotaging his buildings." "I'm a businessman protecting my own interests," Reyes said smoothly. "Julian Thorne is trying to walk out of a world he owes his entire fortune to and repaint himself as a legitimate developer the city can trust. That's bad for men like me, Miss Mercer. Very bad. I simply need the transition to fail publicly enough that nobody trusts him with a permit again." "You almost finished a construction crew last week." "An unfortunate necessity." He shrugged like they were discussing weather delays instead of human lives. "Cooperate with me, and nobody else has to be unfortunate. I'll pay you 3 times whatever Thorne is paying, and you walk away clean." Evelyn felt something harden inside her, cold and absolute. "You think I care about money?" "Everyone cares about money, Miss Mercer. Your father certainly did, when he needed mine." "My father made a mistake. You made a choice to be the kind of man who profits from people's desperation." Her voice rose, sharp enough that a few heads nearby turned. "You want my plans so you can finish construction workers and blame it on Julian's incompetence. You want me to help you do it quietly, so nobody ever traces it back to you." "Careful," Reyes said, his smile finally slipping. "This is a public place." "Good." Evelyn raised her voice further, deliberately now, drawing attention from the surrounding booths. "Everyone should hear this. Corbin Reyes just offered me money to leak sabotaged blueprints for a building he's already tried to collapse once." Heads turned across the hall. Conversations stopped. Julian appeared at the edge of the gathering crowd within seconds, his expression shifting from confusion to fury as he pieced together what he was walking into. Reyes's composure cracked for the first time, his eyes darting toward the growing audience. "This is a misunderstanding." "It's a confession," Evelyn said. "You should be more careful about who you try to bribe in a room full of witnesses." By the time Julian reached her side, Reyes had already turned and was cutting through the crowd toward the exit, his polished exterior finally showing cracks as reporters and industry peers murmured behind him. Julian's hand found the small of her back, steady and grounding. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Her hands were shaking again, the adrenaline catching up the way it always did after the danger had passed. "He knew about Lisbon, Julian. Details I never told anyone except you." Julian's jaw tightened, his eyes following Reyes's retreating figure across the hall. Then he's getting his information from somewhere close to me. Closer than I thought. Julian called an emergency meeting the moment they landed back in Chicago. He gathered his 6 most trusted executives in the private headquarters conference room the following morning, the same room where Evelyn had first pointed out the flaws in his flagship tower weeks earlier. She sat beside him now, instead of across from him, a folder of evidence in front of her, though she noticed how carefully Julian avoided naming a suspect out loud. He wanted to watch faces first. "We have a security problem," he said, looking around the table. "Someone with access to our architectural files and site schedules has been feeding information to Corbin Reyes. I want to know who, and I want to know today." Evelyn watched the reactions carefully, the way she'd learned to watch structural stress points for the first sign of failure. Most of the executives reacted the way innocent people react to accusations: confusion, alarm, a scramble to defend their own departments. One man didn't react quite the same way. Malcolm Fenn, Chief Operations Manager, had been with Thorn Enterprises longer than anyone else at the table. He'd been the one who'd hired most of the construction crews, approved most of the vendor contracts, signed off on file access permissions for nearly every project in the company's portfolio. His face went carefully still instead of alarmed, the kind of stillness that came from a man rehearsing his response before he needed it. Evelyn had spent the past 3 days quietly tracing digital access logs, cross-referencing them against the exact dates the sabotaged blueprints had been altered. She hadn't told Julian what she'd found until that morning, wanting to be absolutely certain before she said a name out loud in front of the man it belonged to. "I have the access logs from the architectural server," she said, sliding a printed sheet across the table. "Every file touched in the past 4 months, time-stamped, tied to a login. The revised blueprints for Riverfront Plaza were altered on March 3rd at 11:47 at night. The Midway site plans were altered on March 19th at 10:52 at night. Both times from the same terminal." The room went quiet. Both logins trace back to Malcolm's credentials. Malcolm's composure finally cracked. "That's absurd. Anyone could have accessed my terminal. My office isn't locked at night." "Your office badge was also used to enter the building both nights," Evelyn continued, laying a second sheet on the table. "Security footage confirms you were on site both times, alone, after hours. I checked." Julian's expression hadn't changed, but Evelyn could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a furnace. "Malcolm, you've worked for this company for 11 years. My father trusted you before I ever took over." "Your father built something worth trusting," Malcolm said, his voice suddenly bitter, all pretense gone. "You're the one who decided to throw it away. Legitimate real estate, clean contracts, walking away from everything that actually made this company profitable. You think the city's going to hand a syndicate's son permits and respect just because he wears better suits now? So you sold me out. To Reyes. Reyes offered a partnership that made sense. He understood the business you were trying to abandon. He offered to fund my own division once your legitimate ventures collapsed under the weight of a few well-timed structural failures." Malcolm's hands were flat on the table, no longer hiding anything. "It wasn't personal, Julian. It was survival. I saw which way the wind was blowing, and I made sure I wasn't standing under the building when it fell." "People would have finished," Evelyn said, her voice shaking with a fury she didn't bother hiding. "Construction crews, families. You were willing to let innocent people pay for your business decision." "Casualties happen in construction all the time," Malcolm said flatly. "Accidents get written off. Nobody would have traced it back to sabotage if she hadn't been sharp enough to catch it twice." Julian stood slowly, his chair scraping back against the floor, and for a moment Evelyn thought she was about to see the version of him that his rivals feared, the man his father had raised in a world that solved problems with violence instead of paperwork. Instead, he simply looked down at Malcolm with something colder than anger. "You're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you out, and every asset you hold connected to this company will be frozen, pending a full investigation." His voice didn't rise. "You're fortunate I believe in doing this legally, Malcolm. My father wouldn't have. Security arrived within minutes, and Evelyn watched a man who'd spent 11 years building trust dismantle it in a single meeting, his career ending in the same conference room where hers had quietly begun. She felt no satisfaction in it, only a heavy kind of relief that the leak had finally been sealed. After Malcolm was gone, Julian turned to her, something shifting in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not just gratitude, but something closer to respect, earned through fire. "You found what an entire security team missed," he said quietly. "Twice now." "I just followed the data." "You did more than that." He handed her a fresh folder, one she hadn't seen before. "Full operational authority over the Riverfront project, effective today. Every decision on that build runs through you from here forward." Evelyn stared at the folder, at the weight of what he was handing her, and felt the last of her hesitation about Lisbon quietly dissolve into something that finally felt like a decision she'd made on purpose. With Malcolm gone and the leak sealed, Evelyn threw herself into rebuilding what had nearly been destroyed. She moved her entire operation to a suburban development site north of the city, the smallest of the compromised projects, but the one furthest along in construction, which meant it needed the most urgent correction. She brought in her own hand-picked team of engineers, people she trusted, people who wouldn't flinch at working 18-hour days to strip out sabotaged support structures and rebuild them from the ground up before the next scheduled inspection. Julian visited the site almost every day, though he rarely interfered. He'd learned, over the past few weeks, when to step back and let her work. He'd stand at the edge of the lot in his usual dark coat, watching her direct crews with a confidence that had grown steadily since the night she'd first walked into his penthouse, refusing to flatter him. "You've changed how this crew operates," he said one afternoon, watching a team reinforce a foundation pillar under her direction. "They listen to you the way they used to only listen to me. They listen because I show them the math instead of just giving orders." Evelyn wiped concrete dust from her hands, not looking up from the blueprint spread across a folding table. "People trust what they can verify. That's true for construction crews. It's probably true for cities deciding whether to grant you permits, too." "Is that a lesson or an observation?" "Both." He smiled at that, something easy and unguarded that she'd started to notice more often the longer they worked together. It still caught her off guard every time. The gap between the man who ran half the city's shipping routes and the man who stood quietly beside her at a construction site, genuinely listening to what she had to say. The overhaul took 11 days from start to finish. Evelyn redesigned the load distribution across all 4 sites Malcolm had touched, strengthening support columns beyond the original specifications rather than simply restoring them, building in margins that would hold even under conditions far worse than anything the city's weather could realistically throw at them. She brought in independent inspectors from outside the company to verify every change, refusing to let anyone accuse Thorn Enterprises of grading its own work. The board meeting where she presented the finished results was the first time Evelyn had stood in front of Thorn's full leadership since Malcolm's termination. She walked them through the original sabotage, the corrected specifications, and the independent verification reports, her voice steady despite the number of powerful people watching her. When she finished, Julian stood. 6 weeks ago, this company had structural sabotage buried in 4 active projects, and not one of our internal engineers caught it, he said, addressing the room but looking directly at her. One woman found it, twice before she even worked for us. She then rebuilt every compromised structure to a standard higher than what we originally filed, brought in outside verification without being asked, and did it all in under 2 weeks. He paused. I've spent 3 years trying to convince this board that Thorn Enterprises can be trusted with legitimate commercial development. Evelyn Mercer did more for that goal in 6 weeks than I managed in 3 years. A few board members exchanged glances. One of the older members, a silver-haired woman named Diane, who Evelyn knew had been skeptical of the company's transition from the beginning, spoke up. Miss Mercer, you could have taken Reyes's offer at the expo, walked away with a fortune and no consequences. Her eyes were sharp, assessing. Why didn't you? Evelyn thought about the question honestly before answering. Because buildings aren't just steel and concrete. People live in them, work in them, trust that the walls around them won't fail while they're inside. I don't build things that could hurt people for money. That's not a policy I picked up working here. It's just who I am. Diane studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, something like approval settling into her expression. That's the kind of engineer this company needs leading its transition. The board voted unanimously that afternoon to approve Evelyn's expanded authority over all future Thorn commercial projects, and to publicly announce the company's new independent verification standards as a selling point rather than a liability. By the time the meeting ended, the story had already started shifting in the industry, not Thorn Enterprises nearly suffering catastrophic sabotage, but Thorn Enterprises setting a new safety standard nobody else in the city could match. Julian caught up with her in the hallway afterward, the two of them alone for the first time since the meeting began. "You saved this company," he said quietly. "Not just the buildings, the reputation, the future I've been trying to build since I took over from my father. I did my job." "You did far more than your job, and you know it." He studied her for a long moment, something unspoken sitting behind his eyes. 50 women told me what they thought I wanted to hear. You've never once done that, not from the moment you walked into my penthouse. I don't think I've properly told you what that's meant to me." Evelyn felt her chest tighten under the weight of his gaze, aware that whatever was building between them had stopped being about debts or contracts weeks ago. "You don't have to say it," she said softly. "I already know." The lawsuit against Reyes Holdings took 3 weeks to prepare and 1 afternoon to win. Julian's legal team had built the case methodically, layering Evelyn's structural evidence with the access logs tying Malcolm to Reyes, the security footage from Riverfront Plaza, and a recorded statement from the expo where 3 separate witnesses confirmed hearing Reyes attempt to bribe Evelyn for sabotaged blueprints. It wasn't a case built on rumor or reputation. It was built on paper, timestamps, and testimony that couldn't be argued away. The arbitration center downtown filled with lawyers from both sides that morning, along with a handful of reporters who'd caught wind that something significant was about to happen in the ongoing story of Thorn Enterprises' near disaster. Evelyn sat beside Julian at the plaintiff's table, her folder of evidence organized with the same precision she brought to every blueprint she'd ever drawn. Reyes arrived with his own legal team, his composure fully restored since the expo, though Evelyn noticed the tightness around his eyes that suggested he understood exactly how much trouble he was in. The arbitrator, a stern woman named Judge Halloway, who Julian had warned Evelyn wouldn't tolerate theatrics from either side, opened the proceedings by reviewing the submitted evidence. Reyes's attorney tried to argue that Malcolm Fenn had acted alone, that no direct financial trail connected his client to the sabotage itself. Evelyn had anticipated that argument weeks earlier. "If I may," she said, when Julian's lead attorney gestured for her to present the technical evidence. She stood and walked the panel through the altered blueprints one final time, explaining in plain, careful language exactly how the changes had been made, how consistently they matched across all 4 sites, and how the timing lined up precisely with dates Malcolm's financial records showed unexplained deposits from an offshore account, later traced back to a shell company controlled by Reyes. "This wasn't one man acting independently," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the room watching her. "This was a sustained campaign across multiple projects over several months, requiring both inside access and outside funding. Mr. Fenn provided the access. Someone else provided the money and the motive." She turned toward Reyes without hesitation. "At the Architectural Expo in Indianapolis, in front of multiple witnesses, Mr. Reyes personally offered me a bribe to leak the corrected structural plans and reference details about my personal situation that he could only have known through illegal surveillance." Reyes's attorney objected. The objection was overruled. By the time Evelyn sat back down, she could see the shift happening across the room, the reporters scribbling faster, Reyes's own legal team exchanging the kind of glances that meant they already knew where this was heading. Julian's closing argument was brief and precise, none of the theatrical fury Evelyn half expected from a man who'd nearly lost everything to this scheme. Instead, he spoke calmly about the buildings that could have collapsed, the construction crews who could have been gone, the months of deliberate, patient sabotage designed to destroy a legitimate business transition through fear and violence rather than fair competition. "My company chose to compete honestly," he said, looking directly at Reyes. "Mr. Reyes chose to compete through attempted finishing disguised as construction accidents. I'd ask this panel to consider which of us actually belongs in the legitimate business world we're both trying to operate in." Judge Holloway didn't take long to deliberate. The ruling came down hard against Reyes Holdings, full financial liability for the sabotage across all 4 sites, a permanent injunction barring Reyes from any future contact with Thorn Enterprises or its employees, and a referral to federal prosecutors for the surveillance and attempted bribery charges that fell outside the arbitration's civil jurisdiction. Reyes's company, already weakened by the public fallout from the expo, would likely not survive the financial penalties intact. Evelyn watched Reyes's composure finally shatter as the ruling was read, his polished exterior collapsing into something bitter and small. He didn't look at her as he was escorted out by his own attorneys. She didn't need him to. Outside the arbitration center, reporters gathered on the courthouse steps, shouting questions about Thorn Enterprises' future, about the sabotage scandal, about the engineer who'd apparently caught it all before it turned deadly. Julian stopped to answer a few, his hand finding the small of Evelyn's back the same way it had the night at Riverfront Plaza, steady and grounding. "Miss Mercer," one reporter called out, "how does it feel knowing your work exposed one of the biggest corporate sabotage schemes this city has seen in years?" Evelyn thought about the question for a moment, aware that whatever she said next would likely end up in tomorrow's headlines. "I didn't do this to expose a scheme," she said finally. "I did it because buildings shouldn't fail on the people trusting them to stand. Everything else was just following the truth wherever it led." Julian glanced at her as the crowd of reporters shifted their questions toward the company's future, something warm and unguarded in his expression that had nothing to do with the victory they'd just won, and everything to do with the woman standing beside him. "Legally, we've dismantled him," Julian said quietly, once they'd finally made it clear of the crowd. "Not a single illegal maneuver on our end. My father would have solved this with violence in a single night. I solved it with paperwork and the truth, because you insisted we do it that way." "You didn't need me to insist," Evelyn said. "You already knew it was the right way. I just made sure you had the evidence to prove it." Julian looked at her for a long moment on the courthouse steps, the city moving busily around them, and Evelyn had the distinct feeling that whatever came next between them had nothing left to do with debts, contracts, or sabotage at all. 4 weeks after the ruling against Reyes Holdings, Riverfront Plaza reached its final milestone. The last support beam went up on a clear October morning, the entire structure finally standing exactly as Evelyn had designed it, stronger than the original plans, verified from foundation to rooftop by 3 separate independent inspection teams, with not a single flaw left unaccounted for. The city had taken notice. What started as a scandal about sabotage had turned, over the past month, into something closer to a case study. 2 other developers had already reached out to Thorn Enterprises, asking about their new independent verification standards. The permits office that had once hesitated over Julian's name now processed his applications faster than almost anyone else's in the city, citing the transparency of the Riverfront project as a model for how commercial development should be handled. Julian asked Evelyn to meet him at the tower the evening the final inspection cleared, at the top-floor observation deck that wouldn't officially open to the public for another 3 months. She found him standing at the railing when she arrived, the entire Chicago skyline spread out beneath them, gold and glittering as the sun dropped low over Lake Michigan. "You wanted to see the view before anyone else did," she said, walking up beside him. "I wanted you to see it first." He didn't look away from the skyline. "You're the reason it's still standing. It felt right that you'd be the first person to stand up here and look out at it." Evelyn joined him at the railing, taking in the view, the river winding through downtown, the smaller buildings scattered like pieces on a board, the life of an entire city moving beneath them, unaware of how close some of it had come to catastrophe months earlier. She thought about how far she'd come since that first night, walking into his penthouse expecting nothing more than a ride home. 10 weeks ago I had a plane ticket to Lisbon, she said. I was ready to disappear and never think about any of this again. I remember. I don't think about Lisbon anymore. She turned to look at him. I haven't in weeks. Julian reached into his coat and pulled out a folder, one she recognized instantly, the original employment contract from that first meeting in his corner office, the one she'd signed weeks into their partnership after finally deciding to stay. He set it on the railing between them and, without a word, tore it cleanly in half. Evelyn stared at the torn pages. Julian, I'm not firing you, he said, a trace of humor breaking through the seriousness in his voice. I'm ending the arrangement that started this. You didn't come to me because you wanted a job, Evelyn. You came because I insisted, because I saw something in you I wasn't willing to let walk away. That contract was built on an imbalance I don't want between us anymore. Employer and employee. Someone who owns the company and someone who works for the company. Then what are you offering instead? He reached into his coat again, pulling out a second folder, thinner than the first. He handed it to her without ceremony, watching her face as she opened it. It was a partnership agreement. Full co-ownership of the commercial development division, her name printed alongside his at the top of the page, equal standing in every decision that would shape the future of everything they'd rebuilt together. I don't want an employee anymore, Julian said quietly. I want a partner. Someone who tells me the truth even when it's inconvenient, who catches what everyone else misses, who cares more about the people inside these buildings than the profit they generate. I found that in you the first night we met, and I've spent every week since then more certain of it. Evelyn looked down at the agreement, her hands steady this time in a way they hadn't been the first time he'd handed her paperwork that changed her life. This is a business decision. It's not just a business decision, and you know that. His voice softened, the certainty in it giving way to something more vulnerable than she'd ever heard from him. I've built an empire out of contracts and calculated risks, Evelyn. I know exactly what I'm offering when I say I want you standing beside me, not just running numbers for a company I own. I'm asking you to stay because I choose you, on your own terms, for exactly who you are. Not because of a debt, not because of an arrangement from that first night, because somewhere in the last 10 weeks, I stopped imagining any version of this company, or this life, without you in it. The wind picked up slightly across the observation deck, carrying the distant sounds of the city far below. Evelyn thought about the woman who'd walked into his penthouse, refusing to flatter him, who'd almost boarded a plane to disappear from a war she never started, who'd spent the past 2 months proving, piece by piece, that honesty could rebuild what fear and sabotage had tried to destroy. 50 women told you what you wanted to hear, she said finally, closing the folder gently in her hands. I never did. I'm not going to start now. I wouldn't want you to. Then here's the truth. She met his eyes, steady and certain. I'm staying. Not because of the partnership, not because of the debt you paid, and not because you tore up a contract on top of a building I designed myself. I'm staying because somewhere between the blueprints and the sabotage and everything that almost went wrong, I found something worth staying for. Julian's expression softened into something she'd never seen on him before, unguarded in a way that had nothing to do with towers or contracts or rival syndicates. Below them, the city lights began flickering on one by one as evening settled over Chicago, illuminating a skyline that stood a little stronger, a little safer, because a fearless engineer had once refused to lie to a man who'd stopped believing anyone ever would.